Good morning and welcome to the latest edition of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. We're glad you can join us today. My name is Kayla Miller, and I'm honored to serve as the Manager of Association Development here at NSSA. We're delighted to have a brand new guest with us today. Miss Erin Miller is the Executive Director of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, also known as Space ISAC. The Space ISAC is a 501c6 public-private partnership and the only all-threat security information source for the public and the private space sector. I just want to give a little bit of background on Erin to kind of preface this discussion. Erin has been passionate about P3 for her entire career, and this is actually the third nonprofit launch that she has led. Erin has over a decade of experience cultivating meaningful partnerships between industry, academia, and government. Prior to her role in Space ISAC, she served as the managing director of the Center for Technology, Research, and Commercialization, and she brought 3 USAF-funded programs to bear at the Catalyst campus for technology and innovation. Her expertise in brokering unique partnerships using non-FAR type agreements led to the stand-up of the Air Force's first cyber-focused design studio, AF CyberWorks, at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the first space accelerator, Catalyst Accelerator, at Catalyst campus in Colorado Springs. This was, of course, done in partnership with the Air Force Research Laboratory and AFWorks. So a truly remarkable career. Now, just kind of a brief word about the structure of this discussion before we get started. I'm going to shortly turn the mic over to Erin for opening remarks, followed by some Q&A. I'll go ahead and begin the questioning, but as with all of our SpaceTime interviews, for those of you who are familiar with our kind of flow of show, we strongly encourage audience participation. So just please enter any short questions you may have by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to get through as many questions as possible in the time allotted. Erin, thank you again for joining us today and for your important work supporting our warfighters and the National Security Space Enterprise. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kayla. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm also pleased to be able to share with you some of the background and where we're at with the Space ISAC about 4.5 years after standing it up. So I'll just jump right into that. Back in 2019, we stood up this thing called a Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And really the industry stood it up, the global space community, but it was at the request of the White House. So an interagency group and the S&T Science and Technology Partnership Forum, which is chaired by NASA, they had spent some time studying the problem set, which is that we have a burgeoning commercial space sector, and we continue to have that. And historically, we have a lot of government funding that has gone to our space systems. So when we look at the dynamics that are at play, then there was an obvious need to break down the silos of threat and vulnerability information sharing across public and private sector. So in order to do that, then they highly recommended that we better have an ISAC. We need a space ISAC. And so if you are familiar at all with ISACs, you know that there are a few others. We're the 30th or so ISAC. I kind of lost count. You can go check out the National Council of ISAC's website, and you can see the other ones. We're a member of the National Council of ISACs. There's also an EU Council of ISACs, of which we're a member. And these organizations are in existence to protect critical infrastructure. So that's why we exist as well. Space systems are critical infrastructure. Our mission, as you can see here, is to facilitate collaboration across the global space industry to enhance our ability to prepare for and respond to vulnerabilities, incidents, and threats, disseminating timely and actionable information to our members and our partners. And we serve as the primary communications channel with respect to this information. Now, Space ISAC has grown quite a bit in the last 4 years, and you can see pictured here, we have a watch center. It's a pretty awesome place to go to envision that there is a place in the world that you can track the adversary from ground to space. Is just really very exciting. Headquartered in Colorado Springs, we have our watch center and our cyber vulnerability lab, and we have room to grow. So we're in the UCCS, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs Cybersecurity Building, and there's a lot going on in this local ecosystem as well as the global space community, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So I shared a little bit about the background of the Space ISAC, why we're here. This wasn't my idea. This was the idea of the White House. And we used a lot of best practices from other ISACs to build out the organization. A few things that we had to ensure was that we were going to be sustainable, taking a multi-decade approach, global, and highly operational. So you'll see those themes run through everything that I say about the Space ISAC. We now have over 100 members in our organization, and they come from places throughout the world, with the exception of the adversarial nations that clearly are attacking critical infrastructure these days and have been for a while. Then we invite the global space community to join us and form this trusted information sharing community to raise the overall security posture for the space industry. And that's what our vision is to raise the security posture for the global space community. And we do that by providing alerts, recommendations, and warnings out through our information sharing portal, which is connected to the Watch Center. In order to do this, we had to have a lot of strong investment from the commercial sector. The commercial sector had to stand up the Space ISAC. Even though the government called for the need, we could not actually have an ISAC without the commercial sector coming together with the public sector. So we have founding board members that you can see here. There's a broad variety of representation across the board. We have commercial, international, defense, and we have FFRDCs, UARCs, as well as universities. And those types of organizations are all welcome to join the Space ISAC at any level, not just the board level. One of our newest members is Capella Space. They are a smaller company as compared to the multi-billion-dollar corporations on the board. However, making a huge impact on the space community. And their voice on the board has been a very powerful impact to the commercial space community right now. So looking at the Watch Center a little bit further, we are tracking the adversary from ground to space using commercial unclassified information sharing and sharing from the government. So when we all work together, we're able to raise the overall security posture. We started last year in this operational capacity. We achieved our IOC, our initial operational capability for the Watch Center in 2023. And we had to build it from the ground up. This Watch Center didn't exist. We designed and built it, working in partnership with our community. We brought in some additional funds that allowed us to build out the Watch Center and perform this operational function. We work with our members on a regular basis in the analyst working group in particular to set the threat level for the space sector. And so every month you can see a publication if you subscribe to our member portal that identifies what the current threat level is for the global space ecosystem. We also offer threat briefings and regular stand-ups that are an extension of the Watch Center capability to our members, and they're identifying what they're seeing that week. So we actually go around the room and conduct a stand-up. It's in a virtual environment, so members from around the world can participate, and their analysts can receive timely, actionable information just through participating in the stand-up, which is pretty awesome. So no reading required for that one. But for our, for our member portal, there is reading required. We do issue out alerts. We also run exercises, and we do this about 4 times a year. All of our exercises are intended to be across critical infrastructure sector, so cross-sector and global, and deal with the geopolitics of the current state of the environment. These exercises really are hands-on, and even though they're run in a tabletop format, they give anyone who attends the experience of being in a crisis action team dealing with an incident and dealing with the response and the emergency response that goes along with having humans involved in the use of critical infrastructure. So moving right along here, we also offer our members, I'm sorry about that, I don't know why it keeps moving. We also offer our members the opportunity to meet every year in a summit format. So annually we convene at the Space ISAC headquarters, as well as in the Center for Performing Arts, which is part of the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs campus. And we talk about the value of space and how to protect that infrastructure. This is really for practitioners and operators to have this more technical level discussion that can inform policy. This year, we're expecting some really big headline names for our keynote speakers and broad global participation. So we really welcome anyone who would like to be part of this conversation to join us on September 25th. Now, I mentioned that Space ISAC has a cyber vulnerability lab. So real quickly here, I want to share with you that our vulnerability lab exists as a node as part of a broader network. The goal here is to do hardware and software testing and use the vulnerability equities process to disclose vulnerabilities to the community. Now, the vulnerabilities that we see that affect space systems are frequently found in commercial off-the-shelf products. So this is a way for us to really lean forward and address some of these COTS vulnerabilities and get the information disclosed in a trusted manner so that the information goes out through our information sharing portal to our member companies and our partners in a way that they can recognize what the impact is on their system before they maybe deploy a system that contains that. And also works in direct coordination with the government and the commercial sector in order to do vulnerability disclosure. So we'll be growing this capability out over the next year. It's currently in a pilot phase, but our Cyber Vulnerability Lab committee will start to approve projects in the fall and move towards operational status. And we're also working with the rest of the community outside of our lab that offer test beds and proving grounds to disclose vulnerabilities from those environments as well. So we can really get ahead of the adversary. Now, here's the slide that my computer just really wanted to show you. This is the public-private sector model of the Space ISAC. So we have on the left-hand side, the private sector companies, and the right-hand side, the government partners. This is hardly representative of the entire community at this stage because we have so many international partners who have really jumped on board to address space system cybersecurity. So throughout the world, we're now working with, I think it's 10 to 15 international space agencies. We're working with the UK, Israel, Canada, the EU, USPA, and ESA. We're working with Taiwan. We're talking to India soon here about a partnership. We're also working with the French Space Agency, the Germans, and the Greeks. And it feels like I'm missing someone. Oh, Japan, absolutely. Don't want to forget them. So there's a huge global collaboration underway where we have MOUs or we're negotiating an MOU right now to get in place bidirectional information sharing. I would have put all of the logos for all the US government partners on here, but they would never fit. There are over 50 US government agencies that have space as part of their mission. And as I mentioned earlier, over 100 commercial entities are part of the Space ISAC, representing launch communications, space vehicles, space systems engineering, payload designers, cybersecurity, and cloud and data processing. When we all work together, we can raise the security posture for the global space community, and that's our #1 priority. So I want to tell you a little bit about more about our Watch Center before we turn to Q&A here. So looking at this picture, you can see that the Watch Center is broken down into coordination cell, all-source cell, terrestrial signals, and space cell. This Watch Center is heavily member-driven. So we have public and private sector entities that are represented in the Watch Center, and they're driven by threat scenarios. Threat scenarios have data, tools, and analysts from our members and partners all supporting them. And that's how we create collective defense. So an attack against one is an attack against all, and that's how we approach life here at Space ISAC. When we track the adversary from ground to space in the Watch Center, then we started identifying threat scenarios based on member input. So in green, you can see the initial operational capability of the Watch Center. Our nation state actor activity focus is in large partnership with Microsoft. We do cyber threat intel sharing, which is CTI in green there, CTI enrichment, and that requires all members to get involved and share threat information with the Space ISAC through our threat intel platform. We also conduct information sharing about RFEMI. purposeful interference that's taking place. And we work very closely with the Kratos Network Operations Center and the Kratos Global Sensor Network to share that information with our members. We also work with Kratos to share information about satellite maneuvers out of the normal pattern of life. And moving into phase 2, there's a company as well behind all of those threat scenarios, maybe even more than one company. And there's a data set, and there's also threat intelligence that needs to be shared. So we're moving into this model where we're able to adopt even more threat scenarios. And throughout the course of 2025, we'll begin to incrementally roll into phase 2 of the Watch Center and share the most robust threat intelligence for the space community that could exist. So here's a little bit more about phase 1, just going into the details of what does purposeful RF interference, satellite maneuvers, and nation-state actor activity and cyber threat intel enrichment really mean. We've spent a lot of time on these phase 1 threat scenarios, and we're very excited because phase 2 is going to bring so much more diversity into the conversation. And we're already working on some of these issues. For example, looking at phase 2, space weather is a high priority. We just had a G5 storm and it impacted our critical infrastructure. So when we look at the future of the Watch Center, bringing in information from our member companies, we're going to be able to create truth data around the actual impacts and the resilience of the space community, commercial and international space community, to these types of space weather events. So that's the focus there, is taking the predictions and measuring it against the actual reality and creating that truth data set for space systems owner operators. There's an example like that for every one of these. Not sure I have time to go into it, but I would like to continue the conversation here with Kayla. So I'll go ahead and close out with an invitation to all of you to join our over 100 member organization and be part of collective defense for the space sector. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Erin. I think, first of all, that's an amazing model that you have where it really sounds like companies can protect their proprietary information while also see alerts that give them intel that they can really take decisive action on. We had a question in the comments kind of related to this topic. How does the Space ISAC address the sensitivity of that information being shared?
Yes, so it's all could be considered sensitive. There's different ways to share information into the Space ISAC. So we have come up with a mechanism that is very closely modeled after how the other ISACs share information. So we use the traffic light protocol. You might have seen some of the TLP amber and green on my slides. The TLP amber information means that it's for member companies of the Space ISAC, the private sector only. So there's no assumption that information is automatically going to flow from the Space ISAC to a government partner. TLP green means that it's shared with the government, and TLP red is private close hold information. So we frequently issue alerts about RF interference and maneuvers out of the normal pattern of life and cyber attacks against companies TLP red, and we ask them if they're ready for that information to be anonymized and shared more broadly. And that's the goal, is to get to that point where we have the trust high enough that they would immediately say, yeah, let's anonymize this, let's get the information out to the broader community as fast as we can. There's also data that's shared from member companies that they have already predetermined, so there's no human in the loop as they're sharing it with us. That's machine-to-machine sharing. And that allows for a very streamlined process of sharing indicators of compromise and events that might be affecting space systems in a timely, actionable way.
It's a great way to establish cohesion. Kind of speaking, going into the threats issue a little bit more, you mentioned that Space ISAC releases kind of a threat level, their assessment. You all have reaffirmed your recommendation to maintain the threat level at level 3, I believe it is. Can you talk a little bit more about that criteria and what that means more generally for the space community?
Yeah, level 3 is really about sustained attacks against space systems, critical infrastructure. So I guess you could say, simply put, there's been no break in the action. You know, we've been watching for the last 2 years continued increase in number of attacks against critical infrastructure, and that includes space systems. So whether it's the actual space systems that are under attack through attacks against the critical infrastructure itself, or what the C-suite might be considering what they own. So they own and manage the risk of their space system, and their business is on the line. So if it's not that, it's their supply chain and or adjacent sectors. For example, manufacturing is heavily impacted by cyber attacks. And all of those are attempts to, make their way into the critical infrastructure and conduct living off the land activities or other such trends that we're seeing.
Gotcha. And these kinds of threats, of course, they don't just affect the space community, they affect broader critical infrastructure. But to what extent do America's adversaries focus their cyber attacks and cyber espionage on space companies? Do you feel like they focus more on traditional, larger companies, or are the smaller startups starting to see more action on that front?
I don't know that I have a comparison in my head between large and small. What I do know is that the types of attacks are different depending on the type of company. So, the adversary practices their TTPs and they figure out what works, and then they use that technique. And what we are seeing related to space systems is that there's a space layer associated with the space systems, things that are in space, the link segment, and there's a lot more work that's being done to analyze and detect when an attack is actually happening against a spacecraft or the link segment, and when it's also impacting that same space system on the ground. So looking at the system holistically and being able to, like I said, the Watch Center is doing, track the adversary from ground to space, means thinking of a comprehensive approach of what a space system is, and not always looking at it through its different components and different elements and thinking this is just a supply chain issue. There's no way it would impact the link segment or the spacecraft, but in fact, it's a holistic system. And we see the adversaries making attempts to deny and degrade services in one domain that leads to impacts in other domains and vice versa.
Gotcha. And the solution needs to be holistic as well. So I guess that's a good segue kind of into mitigation efforts. Space is a challenging place to operate in. Technological advances are happening so fast, it can very quickly make protections that are built in obsolete, or the introduction of that new tech can increase the attack surface as well. So from the view of the space ISAC, what steps can and should US space companies of all sizes take to immediately bolster their cybersecurity posture? What kind of things should they really be focused in on?
Well, I think the basics would be good, implement NIST 800-171. But as far as a space company goes, then I think there's some real challenges within the corporations right now. Some of what I'm hearing is that there's security operations centers and there's space operations centers, and having them work together to view and take an all threats, all hazards approach is really ideal going forward. And I know I use the word ideal, so that means it's a learning curve and it's a challenge that we face, I think, culturally, is bringing together the security operations team and the space operations team and any team that's involved in software security and supply chain risk management. But all of those types of organizations working together is essential for us to take this holistic approach. And then I would say, and not that I'm not biased at all on this, but we have to do threat sharing in a community format. And I don't just mean have a conversation. I mean the machine-to-machine threat intel sharing and connecting our systems in a way that allows for the security operations centers and the space operations centers to receive those threat feeds and work with their community. So Space ISAC, in our next phase, we are definitely going to be working with the other ISACs, because the more communities we can connect together, and the EU is standing up a Space ISAC, working with that community as closely as we possibly can to do sharing across the globe. Which reminds me, sorry, I'm just going to continue on this one if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In Australia, we are planning on expanding our Watch Center. So phase 2 of the Watch Center does include more international partnerships, as I mentioned, but that international partnerships the vast number of them allows us to move towards a more of a 24/7 approach to our watch center. So that's our goal, is really to bring the community together as much as possible, because that's what's going to allow for collective defense.
Absolutely. Threat sharing is critical, no doubt about it. And I'll kind of touch on that a little bit more as we go into the discussion. Pivoting just a little bit, there's also a lot of chat about encouraging companies to adopt, a cybersecurity mindset, really thinking proactively about system adaptation before pen even hits the paper on some of these designs. Implementation of stricter authentication protocols, which is, of course, a cornerstone of zero trust architecture. But there's also a push and pull between security and ease of access. I'm reminded of that every time I lock myself out of an account because it has as many security layers as a 7-layer bean dip. Not to mention concerns of cost and compliance, which comes up with US government regulation. So with all of these factors, how do you incentivize the adoption and prioritization of improved cybersecurity practices across the community?
Mm. Well, I'm not sure if I have to incentivize it. I think the adversary has made it pretty clear that the incentive is there. So typically what we see is financially motivated attacks. So if you think about that and you bring it to the C-suite level, then if your company is not designing security and resilience capabilities into its systems and into its business model and the approach overall, then you're at a potential loss of revenue and or other value proposition to your company. But then, multiply that times the number of companies that we have in this global space community, and look at the attack surface and look at what those capabilities are used for. A lot of them are used for humans to have access to the 16 critical infrastructure services that are identified in the US. And I say in the US because we have a different set of critical infrastructure than other countries in the world. But when we look at what space systems are used for, then it's our national security, it's our national defense, it's our energy sector, it's our food and food supply chain, it's our aviation and our automotive industries, it's everything that we rely on. So what you're putting at risk by not investing in security and not maturing the technology and the capability to make it useful is all of these different dependencies. So that's not heavy or anything, but it is the reality of the situation.
Absolutely. And, I want to pivot back to more as well on the cost and regulation bit. We had a lot of questions coming in about government relations with industry. The DoD had released their proposed rule for CMMC that laid out kind of the plans that roll out. What are your take on those? Are the minimum standards required for certification appropriate in your view? How do you think those regulations impact companies in the space industrial base?
So I think that regulation is necessary to some extent. But what I also fully recognize, because I live this every day, is that you can't regulate what you don't actually have technology to implement for. So there are some gaps. Right now, our SPD5 task force, which was stood up in 2020 when SPD5 came out, they're looking at what the gaps are for the space sector. There's a lot of different controls and different frameworks that could be applied across the board to any company, any sector, but in particular, the defense industrial base. And those may yield gaps. They don't cover everything that's related to a space industrial base company. And when you look at the global scale of space systems and look at a space system holistically, then there are gaps start to emerge that not all of these controls and frameworks really align with what we might need. And there are also technology gaps to even implement some of the existing controls. So the SPD5 task force is working on a report on this. I would be happy to share it with NSA once it's available, but I think it's kind of the beginning of a conversation around, how much can we regulate in areas where we don't have the technology to implement.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of addressed this already with that answer, but I just want to flesh it out a little bit further. Government and industry collaboration is of critical importance, as you mentioned, to ensuring our collective defense. Overall, how would you assess the level of collaboration on cybersecurity between the US government and the space industry? You mentioned some of those strengths and shortfalls. We had a question come in about any constructive criticism you may see from your member companies or broader than that regarding the US government's handling of cybersecurity infrastructure right now.
So with respect to government collaboration and their support for working with the industry, the way that I have been maxed out on my time over the last 7 days gives you pretty good indication of the interest that the government has in collaborating with industry. I won't name all of the agencies, but over the last 7 working days, there hasn't been a day that I haven't had a meeting with a US government agency trying to figure out how to work more closely with the space industry, global space community, I should say. So this is a high priority right now, and I have been nothing but encouraged to see the kind of transition in mindset and the shift over to recognizing that we can do threat information sharing in a commercial unclassified manner. We can document TTPs and APTs and countermeasures for impacts on space systems. And it doesn't have to be done in a classified environment only. It can be done unclassified, and this is what we do every day, and the government's very interested. And this was their idea in the first place, so I'm glad to see it. And with respect to the implementation of regulation related to cybersecurity, the ISACs enable that. So what I would say is that if you don't have a community to go to talk about how you're going to implement best practices or align with standards, and you don't have a community or sector conversation going about that, then get involved in your ISAC. If you're not part of the Defense Industrial Base, or sorry, National Defense ISAC or the Space ISAC, then you're not having the conversation in a forum where they take this topic the most seriously and are ready to support the discussion. And then if you're still having challenges, those ISACs can go to the government and approach them and say, well, our sector has this challenge. And I'm not talking about government affairs and lobbying. I'm talking about cybersecurity professionals legitimately saying we have this challenge because we've tried and this is not something that can be done the way that it's written, or it's not the most optimal way because there are other technologies that would allow us to implement security for our sector in a better manner. So I think ISACs are probably one of the most effective tools that we have to implement cybersecurity regulation, and they need to be used that way.
I think that's a great tie-in back to mitigation efforts and what steps companies can take to protect themselves. Join a space ISAC or join an ISAC to promote that information sharing. And also a separate topic I kind of wanted to go in on mitigation as well is workforce development. So at NSA, we have a sector dedicated to workforce development. We talk about things like the importance of attracting and retaining talent, facilitating professional development opportunities, and also encouraging kind of the adoption of a more nuanced view of cybersecurity practices. Because it's not just all about the technical aspects, right? I mean, when you're dealing with a non-Western nation state actor, for example, you need professionals who have a holistic understanding of those regions, the historical context, sociopolitical pressures, et cetera. So really broadening that narrative so you not only recognize the blind spots, but you can also better anticipate them. So with all that in mind, do you feel like there are a lot of gaps in workforce development? And if so, what are your thoughts on what industry and government could be doing better to acquire and retain those skilled folks? So what's Space ISAC doing to focus on that as well?
Yeah, Kayla, that's a good topic. Always one that gets people excited because investing in the next generation is something that we must do. We're all living this out on a daily basis right now, and I'm sure most of us go, wow, if only we could have taken this class and that class and this class so that we would have a better perspective on maybe just geopolitics in general. The dynamics are so complex. How do we possibly teach the next generation everything that they need to know to deal with these things. Well, Space ISAC, we started addressing this at the beginning of the ISAC. We thought, if we're going to have an operational watch center where we're going to track the adversary from ground to space, we better start including the next generation in that conversation as early as possible. So we established a fellows program, and the fellows program is geared towards inviting students to sit on the watch floor and work about 10 hours a week minimum is the ideal situation. And they learn cybersecurity, space, and intelligence. And they learn to think of all of the different dynamics that go into protecting a space system, from the economic factors to the maybe how to share threat information, the different components of a space system. Now, the evolution of the space economy and how we're going to be using these systems going forward. For example, the next generation iPhone is going to connect directly to satellite. So every phone that you have in your hand, if you buy a new one, I don't upgrade that often, but I like to upgrade. So I'm going to be direct to satellite. And this challenge of everything highly interconnected isn't going away. And I think having students in the Watch Center learning cybersecurity, space, and intelligence is going to be critical going forward. So as many programs that we can come up with that will teach the workforce, maybe new entrants to the workforce, they can reskill or upskill, or existing workforce or students about the interdisciplinary nature of space systems, I think the better off we'll be.
That sounds like an incredible program. So any students that are watching this interview right now, get plugged in. It sounds like there's fellowship opportunities, there's opportunities to get involved with this exciting work that Erin's doing right now. I want to bounce a little bit back to the threats, because I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in on that. What kind of vulnerabilities are you seeing most exploited right now? I know it's sensitive, so whatever you can share, but are there a lot of insider threats? Any trends on physical kinetic attacks on satellites, a focus maybe on acquiring company data or information on space system designs, kind of all of the above? I mean, what are some of the trends that you're following?
Mm-hmm. Well, our threat scenarios of the Watch Center closely align with the trends that we're seeing. We picked those threat scenarios because we were told by our members that they're impacting critical infrastructure on a daily basis, if not more often than that. So supply chain risk is continues to come back as one of the hot topics, one of the biggest concerns. But also along with that is the software bill of materials task force that we stood up. Software bill of materials is designed to illuminate the recipe or ingredients that are used in software. And when we standardize our approach to measuring success for the space industry, we find that we're going to be more successful in determining whether or not we're actually using secure software or not. So we have this task force that works with the Space Force and the Air Force and their software portfolios to set the standard going forward. There's a lot of concern there because of non-memory safe code that's being used, but also the cyber physical dynamics of a space system and how you would convert over to memory safe code is challenging in some respects. But then also the vast number of attacks against those software repositories that where open source software lives is another challenge. So this dynamic continues to get more complicated, and I'm glad we have the task force that's working on it. They do also work with the ICT SCRIM task force. That's part of DHS. So this does roll up to a broader conversation across all critical infrastructures. It's not just limited to space. We also have a lot of frequent activity in our signal cell that's monitoring jamming of signals. And so pairing that with maneuvers out of the normal pattern of life, you see signal suppression when there's maneuvers out of the normal pattern of life, and then also impacts on the ground that would, like I mentioned, indicate that there's living off the land activities taking place. So the adversary is found their way in, and they're going to hang out there for a while and continue to make their way laterally into other resources that are available. All of this combined is what creates the challenge, is managing all of that. I wouldn't say that any one is worse than the other. It's all of it combined.
And a lot of that input, you get it from your members, but also you mentioned your coordination with government, internationally as well. So you get that information coming in from different sources. Is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah, and in the Watch Center, we like to come up with our own acronyms. So even though, we we're working with the defense community, with the IC, with commercial and with international, then we end up coming up with our own recognition of the symptoms of the problem. So, these challenges that we're seeing today, they could evolve. So living off the land could evolve to living off the constellation. There's everything touches everything as a service. These dynamics that are at play where everything is so hyper interconnected and all types of infrastructure are continuously under attack. We've seen the most cyber SIGACs, is what we refer to them as in our reporting, that we've ever seen. So every week we're reporting over 100 attacks against critical infrastructure. And that's just what the Space ISAC is able to come up with off of our own resources. Now, if we were receiving, the whole community's worth of sharing, like we talked about, moving towards this global environment where the MOUs are operational and the EU Space ISAC, the Australians, the Canadians, everyone sharing with us, imagine how high that number really is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, given how interconnected everything is, that really makes international collaboration all the more important here. I mean, there's clear consensus that safeguarding our systems isn't just an issue of national security, but it's a global security issue as well. And we really recognize the importance of cultivating those partnerships with our allies abroad to build a more robust network of defense. You gave a great overview at the beginning of the presentation of some of your relationships with international partners and some MOUs that you have. So let's dive into that a little bit more. I believe your team held was it a tabletop exercise in April out in Paris. Can you talk a little bit about those activities? What was kind of the impetus behind that? What lessons were learned, and were there any actionable items that came out of that?
Yeah, that was a fantastic exercise. We worked with the company Frontier Foundry to co-develop a threat scenario there, or a tabletop exercise scenario, where a on-orbit moon mining mission was taking place. And the on-orbit moon mining mission is obviously compromised in some way. That's kind of the whole premise of it. And we had crisis action teams that had to deal with the situation. So when you're on a crisis action team in one of our exercises, then you're faced with the situation where you have to work with the watch center, because you're a member of the Space ISAC and you're receiving alerts. And what you do with that information is up to the crisis action team and the incident response team. And then the government is also heavily represented in the Space ISAC exercises, because we recognize that that public-private partnership is vital towards our success. And it's always interesting to see how companies decide they're going to engage with government, whether or not they're going to use the Watch Center to engage with the government, whether or not they're going to want to call them directly, who they want to call. Usually, if you ask in these exercises who you want to call first, then people have a different answer every single time. So you get about 25 different responses on which government agency you would call to help you handle your incident. And I think that's a symptom of a broader problem, or a broader challenge, which I know you'll want to talk about in a minute here, so I'll pause on that topic. But also in exercises, we're addressing the geopolitical dynamics, and we're also addressing the cross-sector dynamics. So when human life was at risk in this particular situation, then the human life was one aspect, but then there's also the resources that they were mining for that humans on Earth were dependent on. And so managing all of that from a crisis action team's perspective puts a lot of weight on what is effectively the C-suite of a company, dealing with nation state actors and geopolitical dynamics and the dependency on their critical infrastructure. They, by definition, were critical infrastructure. And so it's fun, I think, to live that out before it really happens to someone. Going through the exercise gives them the experience and puts the pressure on before they have to really deal with it. Ideally, before they have to deal with it.
Absolutely, it's definitely critical to hold those kind of activities. Now,
Mhm.
information sharing is, of course, a cornerstone of what Space ISAC does, and you all do it phenomenally. It's supposed to be like challenging enough to coordinate with stakeholders within the US. I mean, cyber is, of course, very dynamic, it's very nuanced. There's so many facets to it. Systems vary, regulations vary. How do you navigate that when you're coordinating with partners abroad? I'm sure there's a lot of different factors there as well.
Yeah, well, just like when we're working with companies, then we do ask the company to take ownership and responsibility, and I think that's a very positive uh, aspect of what we're doing, is that the organization or the country or company that we're working with, regardless of where they are, they have to bring to us their expectations and their standards for how they operate. So, if a company lets us know that they, let's say in Europe, they've now implemented NIS2. And as a result of implementing NIS2, then they now recognize space as critical infrastructure sector or as critical infrastructure. And so now that carries weight in every conversation that we have with them. We have to recognize the implications of that. So typically what we do, because this is new and evolving, is we stand up a working group or we start to have a collaboration discussion on an ongoing basis that will allow the community to now start moving in that direction of full implementation. A good example of this in the US, the SPD5, was the very first uh, document or release from the US government that's ever come out that had any cybersecurity for space implications. And immediately Space ISAC took action. We stood up our SPD5 task force to talk about how that should be implemented and what the industry's thoughts were on how to move into this new environment where we have regulation related to space systems. So these challenges are going to continue to hit us, and we have to continue to work together to learn how to implement.
And it sounds like Space ISAC is going to continue to foster these relationships and grow in the international space. How can companies get more involved with what you do? There's a lot of interest coming in about getting more globally plugged in. So what kind
Mhm.
of advice would you give to folks looking to bring their companies into the fold?
Well, definitely come to our Value of Space Summit. Learn what we're doing through that forum. You can learn more about the Cyber Vulnerability Lab projects, how we're using the vulnerability equities process to share that information, meet with our committee members, also talk to the Watch Center about what they're doing and how they manage the day-to-day activities of looking at different data sets and tools to share information across the community, and then talk to other Space ISAC members. We have a very involved membership base. So when companies join the Space ISAC, they get involved and they're part of the conversation, and that brings value to them and to the other members. These types of conversations continue every year at Value of Space Summit.
Excellent. Folks, mark your calendars. I went to that last year and it was phenomenal. Highly recommend. I kind of want to go a little bit, press on the international a little bit more, talk about some lessons learned, especially in times of conflict where the learning curve is especially sharp and the stakes are just sky high. One of the case studies is right around when Russia invaded Ukraine, as many of the people on this call are aware of. There was that significant assault on Viasat's modems using a malware called Acid Rain that was used to disrupt Ukrainian military communications. What lessons should space communities take away from cyber operations executed by Russia on Viasat? And as part of that, where do you think, in terms of allocation of resources, where we should focus that energy kind of globally to protecting our systems?
You won't be surprised by my answer. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, then the attack against Viasat was publicly attributed back to Russia. And the nation state actor funded advanced persistent threat actors continue to exist. Sometimes they show up with different names, but they go in, they come back, and they're consistently producing more attacks. And so that means that they aren't a brand new threat actor, they're just evolving. Now, these activities are ongoing and continuous. So, and being in a position where a company could actually defend against the activities of a nation state is not one that I don't think most people anticipate, because a company itself is going to have a very difficult time defending against a nation state actor. The reason why Space ISAC is sharing information about nation state actor activity is because those activities are attributed to nation states publicly, not by Space ISAC, but by other parties. All of the activities, though, that we share related to threat information in Space ISAC is potentially funded by a nation state actor. So in order to defend our critical infrastructure against these activities and attacks, we have to work together. So if your company does not have a mechanism to operate a threat intel platform or consume threat intelligence right now, then that has to change. Because even just subscribing to the information that's publicly available or subscribing to the services that are available from companies that sell this isn't enough. The timely actionable information comes from when companies come together in a community and they're viewing it as an attack against one as an attack against all, and they're sharing timely actionable information in that community. And that threat information is accessible through your sector's ISAC. And that's the only way to outpivot or outmaneuver the adversary, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And timely and actionable intel is absolutely key. We know, for example, there's a new and enhanced variant of acid rain that has the potential for even more expanded disruptions. So cyber isn't just something static that can be weaponized. Tools used to exploit key vulnerabilities evolve and they adapt to really infect the lifeblood of our systems. And that's what makes them so invasive and why we need, as you mentioned, an aggressive cybersecurity posture to get ahead of the curve, but it also needs to be collective. There's just too much information not to be shared among industry. And I guess when we talk about critical systems and critical infrastructure, that's the moment we've all been waiting for is a discussion on that. It's maybe a bit of a more contentious topic. I've heard the discussion on both sides of the spectrum on space designation as critical infrastructure. This is also a question we received from the audience that I'm looking at. We know that space is critical. That's not debated. But when it comes to policy considerations, the debate really seems to get dicey. And there's talk about the need to allocate more energy and resources towards this. But there are also questions about how effective and how tangible those changes would really be, and whether or not space is well defined enough to designate it as such. So does the Space ISAC have a perspective on whether space should be designated as a separate and distinct critical infrastructure? And what do you see as the benefits of this kind of designation?
Yeah, the purpose of the conversation, in my opinion, has to do with how we manage incident response and emergency response when space systems are under attack. So I've shared with you in this conversation that Space ISAC has identified over 50 different US government agencies that have space as part of their mission, and we're working with a global space community. So we all know from our favorite leadership class that when everyone has responsibility, then no one single entity has responsibility. And in our exercises, we see that play out nearly every time. It's almost 100% predictable at this point that if you ask a company in isolation, they're dealing with the crisis, who do they want to call first? Then they're going to pick a different agency than the company down the street. And so who is ultimately responsible for incident response and emergency response of the commercial and our interdependency on international, it expands to international space systems critical infrastructure. There isn't one agency. And this matters when we're talking about coordination of incident response. There should be someone who's responsible for overall sector risk management. And right now, Space ISAC is performing this role from an industry perspective. We are convening and we are creating playbooks. We're having the discussion. We're sharing the threat information. We're having policy recommendation conversations within the Space ISAC about how incident response and emergency response should be done, However, we're not the US government. We cannot serve that role. So ultimately, that's where the conversation I think should pick up is it's not about how are we going to regulate the heck out of this industry. That's not the conversation. The conversation is how are we going to handle an incident when we need to make decisions within seconds and we need a responsible party or responsible agency to look to, or to look across the sector and look at our dependencies that we have as citizens on this infrastructure and identify that sector risk and make the important decisions to be able to manage that sector risk. My example of having iPhones connected to satellites is purely so that we recognize how tangible this is, how much our lives actually depend on the security of space systems. So if there's no one ultimately accountable for that sector risk, then we're putting a lot at stake.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Pivoting again, I'm seeing some questions on the future of space ISAC on your organization, which I know you touched on briefly a bit throughout the session. I saw a question come in from the audience regarding the capacity of the space ISAC. You know, we're having this discussion about all the threats and mitigation efforts and expansion. How large is the organization now, and how much bigger will it be when you expand operations? Where do you see the future of space ISAC going within the next, few years?
Yeah, it's highly scalable because it's member driven. So when we talk about expanding our operational capability, then we're talking about having members actually providing some of that infrastructure. And we have members and so that's private sector and we have government that both participate in our watch center. And so that makes it scalable as well. So we're taking the resources that are already being used to identify the threat and monitor the threat and share that information, but putting it into a coordinated fashion by having a public-private sector partnership. So we're not only reliant on the resources of the Space ISAC staff, we're also using the community to fulfill the mission.
Excellent. And for new companies coming in, I mean, how is it a pretty easy process to onboard as a member and to get them plugged in? You mentioned different workshops you guys do, maybe different planning committees they can get involved in. So what does that look like?
Yeah, we have a member onboarding process that's very streamlined. So companies can start getting involved within days of joining the Space ISAC. And they can engage at their respective member level. So we have the companies that are on the board that have a permanent seat on the board, and then we have the general membership, and it's kind of a tiered approach. So we have platinum and gold membership, which gives access to specific forums and venues, and of course, more free tickets to Value of Space Summit at those levels. But then everyone gets access to Value of Space Summit through their membership as well as our member portal and our collaborative groups where we're having these different conversations I've referred to throughout the conversation today.
Excellent. Well, it appears we are out of time, so I'll go ahead and kind of shift gears a little bit. I hear this over and over again, and I'll just drive it home here. This is a truly transformative period for space. We have the technology, we have all this exciting innovation, but we need that security to protect those systems and to bolster that resiliency as we continue to expand those capabilities. So, Erin, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us today and share your thoughts on this important mission area. NSSA is, of course, here to support all your efforts, and we look forward to a close and continued partnership with Space ISAC. To our audience, that concludes this SpaceTime episode. On behalf of the National Security Space Association, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla.